The BBC has truly gone rogue, and I'm saying this with a great sense of responsibility. And I have reached this conclusion after watching this taxpayer funded public broadcaster's toxic coverage of the latest round of hostage release in Gaza. I said toxic even though this has been nothing less than torturous, to say the least. The BBC's coverage of Gaza hostage release this morning started at 6:30 a.m. when it abruptly stopped its scheduled program Unspun World by John Simpson and decided to cut live to the scenes from Gaza this morning, which is Saturday morning British time.
Do you think that's a possibility?
I can't rule out the possibility that he would try to invade the Baltics, for instance. But of course, the implications of such decision would probably be higher than his attempt to invade Ukraine, because now we're talking about invasion of NATO ally. Yeah. What is scary here is not that he would try to invade, but if the alliance would not stand it. That's the scariest part. That would...
This what happened before. So this seems the one in Jabalia, where the American Keith Siegel, if I'm not mistaken from these pictures, yeah, so it seems like he is.
So let's talk through the three men who are being released today. So we've got Ofer Calderon, who is an Israeli, age 53. We've got Yarden Bibas, Israeli, age 34. And then the American-Israeli Keith Siegel.
As I said, that was 6:39 a.m. British time, more than 5 hours ago. Hamas fighters released three men, including one US national and a dual French-Israeli citizen, around 6:40 a.m. as part of the ceasefire deal. I tried to fast forward the coverage on BBC iPlayer, but was astonished to see that there was absolutely nothing on the BBC except the repetition of visuals from Gaza and other parts occupied by Israel. The BBC's obsession with the story was such that it decided to not cover any other story for more than 5 hours. Yes, I'm not exaggerating. Just see BBC's top headlines at 9 a.m., nearly 3 hours after it decided to start its non-stop coverage on the hostage release. All headlines related to Gaza. No other news from around the world or UK. Also, do pay attention to BBC's editorial dishonesty here, even in its toxic coverage. 3 Israeli hostages were released by Hamas, but 183 Palestinian hostages were being released from Israeli concentration camps. And yet, how does the BBC presenter introduce the news on Palestinians? She says, meanwhile, meaning that whilst you are here, we might as well inform you about a side event.
Live from London, this is BBC News. US-Israeli hostage Keith Siegel is freed by Hamas as part of the Israeli ceasefire deal. He joins 2 other hostages released an hour earlier. Yarden Bibas and Ofer Calderon were freed in a ceremony in central Gaza. The 3 will now be transferred to an Israeli hospital where they'll undergo treatment before being reunited with their families. Earlier that morning, friends and relatives gathered in Tel Aviv to celebrate and wait for news. Meanwhile, Israel is expected to free more than 180 Palestinian prisoners. This is the scene from outside the Ofer prison in the Israeli-occupied West Bank.
In contrast, this is how Sky News, a private TV channel in the UK, ran its headlines exactly at 9 a.m. the same time. Had I not watched Sky News, I wouldn't have learnt about another plane crash in the US.
Hello, a very good morning. It's 9 o'clock. Coming up on the show today, relief for 3 Israeli hostages as they're passed over to the Red Cross by Hamas militants.
And in the Six Nations, a heavy defeat for Wales in their opening match as they failed to score against France in Paris.
It's Saturday, the 1st of February. 3 Israeli hostages are handed to the Red Cross by Hamas as 182 Palestinian prisoners are due to be released later today. A plane crash in Philadelphia sets houses and vehicles ablaze. The city's mayor says the number of casualties is not yet known. In Washington, D.C., 41 bodies of those killed in Wednesday's mid-air collision have been recovered, but just 28 have been identified. More British people than ever are being trapped in modern slavery as Sky News joins a raid on an abattoir suspected of exploiting labour.
And in the Premier League, after 7 weeks without playing, could Marcus Rashford finally be on his way out of Manchester United, with Aston Villa looking to sign him on loan?
As a former BBC editor myself, I'm still not able to understand the editorial merits of the BBC's continuing coverage on the hostage release for more than 5 hours. First, this was heavily biased in favor of Israel. When you observe the tone and terminologies used by BBC presenters, the choice of BBC's guests, and the space it provided to both sides of the conflict. While BBC spoke to a number of Israeli guests, including the relatives of Israeli hostages, there was none from the Palestinian side. So I argue that since 111 out of 183 Palestinian hostages being released were from Gaza, it wouldn't have been possible for the BBC to interview the relatives of those Palestinian hostages. But more than 70 of those released from Israeli concentration camps were from the occupied West Bank. Why did the BBC not speak to any of their relatives in the occupied West Bank? At least for the sake of perceived impartiality or due balance. That's why I say that this organization, where I spent more than 12 years of my journalistic career, has now truly gone rogue. Whose interest are you serving by being so brazen and toxic? What kind of editorial justification would you have for such shenanigans? If you are funded by British taxpayers, how would you justify that giving more than 5 hours of non-stop coverage to the release of 3 Israeli hostages in Gaza is in the best interest of millions of British taxpayers? You might argue that the BBC has a duty to serve British Jewish population, and it may be justified with its decision to devote more than 5 hours of non-stop coverage for the release of 3 Israeli hostages. So let's look at the numbers. According to the 2021 census, the Jewish population in the UK stood at 287,360. In contrast, the population of Indian origin in the UK is a whopping 1.8,064,318. Did the same BBC devote 5 hours of non-stop coverage to the stampede at a Hindu religious event in India's Allahabad last week? Close to 100 people were killed there. How dare the BBC discriminate against British Indians when they contribute far more to its license fee funding? Let's also look at British Muslims. There are 3.9 million Muslims in the UK, and Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza has been a hugely emotive issue for them. Did the BBC reflect their sentiment through similar coverage against Israel in the last 15 months? No. Wouldn't it amount to brazen biases by the BBC in favor of a small group of the population just because they are Jews? Just give me one reason. And this could be anyone. Even you may want to comment. How could you justify non-stop, and I mean non-stop? The BBC did not give space to any other news items in those more than 5 hours, except their standard weather news. This is criminal and editorial fraud. Period. Anyway, fed up with the toxic coverage of the BBC, I tweeted this at 11:30 a.m. by tagging BBC News, the BBC Press Team, and Ofcom. BBC Press Team only because I was interested in the official position of the BBC for my video. Boom! This worked. Within minutes, the BBC ended its torture on millions of viewers as the presenters suddenly realized that there was a plane crash in Philadelphia.
Children. Of course, these are emotional scenes there for his family and others that are being reunited today. Let's also bring you these live pictures that we have coming in from Philadelphia. Of course, this is the scene of what was an air crash that happened in a neighborhood of Philadelphia. We understand this was a medical flight.
Such over-the-top coverage is often reserved for the death of a monarch in the UK or a period of national calamity or mourning and during the counting of votes after the general elections. But not when 3 Israelis are being released from the Hamas captivity and none of them being British national. At one point, a BBC presenter sounded more like Israeli spokesperson when she said this.
They're also holding up the images of the children of Yarden Bibas, one of the men who was released earlier today. They were 10 months old and 4. His 2 children and his wife were also kidnapped on October the 7th. And Hamas said that they were killed in an airstrike. Israel hasn't been able to confirm that.
Israel hasn't been able to confirm? What relationship does the BBC have with Israel that she can say this with so much of conviction on behalf of Israeli government? Shouldn't a self-proclaimed impartial news organization have instead said that Israel has denied or rejected this allegation? You can say the BBC hasn't been able to confirm, but speaking on behalf of Israel, is that the job of a BBC presenter? As I said earlier, the BBC is not even pretending anymore. It truly sounds like a mouthpiece of the rogue regime of Benjamin Netanyahu. You would have thought that the BBC bosses would make amends after frequent criticism from me and others on biases. But no, they keep getting worse with the passing of each day. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and Patreon. If you too think that our journalism is worth supporting, then you too should become part of it. The details are there in the description of the video. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.